formation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Boko, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces deux organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Basila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur. Et ensuite, qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local, chez nous, pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présente, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Bénin Cajou, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières, des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons en ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaki. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadjo nous a aidés. Parce qu'on continuait à suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'anacadie. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site modèle. Nous souhaitons que Bénin Cashew continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Bénin Cashew nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Bénin Cashew pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
En relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacadie.
En termes d'action, Technoserve à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacade qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences lax qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savè, et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour
un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Benin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'Anacadier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre pays.
Pépinériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépinériste, nos matériels végétaux performants vont disparaître. Ce que Benin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Benin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants de la table.
En termes d'action, Technoserve à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savè et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Pépinériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépinériste, nos matériels végétaux performants vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Benin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Upload pictures about your products, your mini site. Platform which gives you this or project, fill with the details, through the process and hit submit.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nords de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Boko, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout fait la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces deux organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Basila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur. Et ensuite, qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local, chez nous, pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technoserve travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Bénin Cajou, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'Anacad et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière Anacad.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'Anacad du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources
Recording in progress.
at low cost. Meanwhile,
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year, Happy New Month.
and welcome back to the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. We appreciate you joining us throughout last year and here again with us this morning. Please note, this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, click on the globe icon on your screen, select your preferred language, and mute the original sound. For any questions or need for clarification, kindly use the Q&A feature and we'll address all of that at the end of the presentation. Now, to dive into today's session, permit me to introduce to us all the anchor of the session, Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim is an award-winning consultant, business coach, and cashew specialist. His experience and knowledge have been gained over 30 years in the food ingredient sector, operating as a major importer of a range of food products and managing sourcing operations, ingredients, oilseed, grains, edible nuts, edible seeds, spices, and dry fruit from across the globe. He is known for his ability to forecast the market and see its challenges from a fresh perspective. In recent years, he has provided advisory, consultancy, and training on the food industry and value chain management in more than 30 countries to a broad range of public and private clients, including the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, UNIDO, ITC International Trade Center, Competitive Cashew Initiative, that's GIZ Move, Conseil du Coton et de la Nacade, USDA Pro Cashew, and of course, the African Cashew Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Blessing. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Jim.
You're very welcome to the first session of the new season. Today, we're going to talk about more or less the prospects for the new seasons. We're going to take some look at what are the key factors that we should be looking at this time of year. And we're going to look at what they mean, what they might mean, and how things might go forward in the course of the coming months. So hopefully you can see the slides on your screen. And let's have a look at some of the things we'll talk about today. So first of all, we're going to focus in a rather general fashion on what are the factors that we should be looking at this time of year. As we know, the propaganda war, if you like, has started. We see RCN buyers in Vietnam telling us that prices are too high. We see buyers of kernels from the United States telling us that they have enough stock forever. We see even African processors talking about farm gate prices should be lower. And we see politicians in some countries playing politics with the cashew sector. So we want to look at what are the real factors away from the distraction of all of those things that can influence the market and the outcomes over the next 6 to 8 months of the cashew season, especially, of course, in West Africa. We'll also look at what happened last year and how what happened last year will influence what may happen this year. We'll have a look at this now apparently endless story of the mismatch between RCN prices and cashew kernels. And we'll finish up by having a look at some of the trends to watch in 2023, some of the big factors that can influence what happens in this business over the next year. So let's start and have a look at some of the things that we might consider as early indicators. And we'll just have a quick look at a map of those. So first of all, at this time of year, February, March, we want to look at the Vietnamese crop situation. Now, not because it's so big, it's only about 7-8% of world production, but it is interesting because it does very much influence the sentiment or the thinking of Vietnamese processors as the year goes on. And those processors buy somewhere around about 2 million tons of RCN every year. Secondly, early indicator, really important factor nowadays is the Cambodian crop. what are the prospects for the Cambodian crop? It's important. It's bubbling just under 20% of the world crop. We look at the RCN stock position in Vietnam, current prices relative to the past prices relative to the averages. Particularly, we want to look at Indian demand, especially this year, following a year of record demand in India. And we need to see what works for RCN in India. It's a little early, but we start to look now at West African crops, the weather, and what are the early buying signals in West Africa. We want to have a look at demand particularly in the US and the European Union, which are accessible markets for African processors. We want to look at how much cover has been taken and how much is demand likely to be in 2023. And we need to make sure that when we look at this, we keep an eye out for the propaganda, the myth, all of those stories thrown into the market in an effort to influence pricing particularly, but also to identify the self-interest of many of the players in the market that try to perhaps distort the market situation and certainly our perception of it at this time of year. So it's about a little bit of a quick look through these factors, and we divide them into three areas. Supply and demand is pretty clear. Sentiment is what people believe. So it's the things that people believe about the market, whether they are true or not. So they may not necessarily be based on fact, but if they believe them, they're clearly going to have an influence on what happens in the market. So key factors on supply, and we're talking now about February. This is not the big picture. We're talking simply about the month of February and the influence in this first quarter of the year. So we're looking at inventories of raw cashew nuts in India and in Vietnam. How much have they got? How long will it last? What kind of quality is it? And what price are they selling it at? We also want to look at the Cambodian crop and the crop progress in West Africa, as I've mentioned. And when we look at crop progress in West Africa, we need to be careful because we see ambitious, exaggerated, politically expedient claims on the size of crops in West Africa. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware that some of these numbers thrown about in the media at this time of year are just not representative of reality. Looking at demand is quite difficult to work with. We can look at demand last year, we can look at the trends in demand, but it is quite difficult to look at the really key factors. What is the forward cover on kernels? In other words, what are the commitments, what are the purchases of roasters for kernels forward into this year? As we know, most kernels buyers tend to buy 3, 6, 9, even a year forward. And that's related to consumer sales. And consumer sales, as we saw last year, are difficult to predict. We've become used to, over many, many years, going back to the 1980s, to typically rising consumer sales for cashew nuts. Last year, that was stopped in its tracks. Then we want to look at inventories for kernels, both in the factories and at destination, and this relationship between raw cashew nuts and kernels prices. I'm going to ask the question a little bit later, how long can this mismatch continue? And finally, of course, we must look at the COVID situation. It hasn't gone away just yet, and it continues to have something of an influence. When we talk about sentiment, well, what influences what people are thinking? Well, if we look at processors, clearly, whether they're making money or not influences their thinking. If we look at traders, whether they need to buy or they need to sell, in other words, their positions, whether they are, in the language of traders, long or short, whether they need to act in the market and what they see as most beneficial for them. Sentiment is also impacted by the economic conditions. I mean, for example, last year, much of the talk was that inflation in Western countries would be with us forever. But we've already seen that inflation is beginning to alleviate, and that is changing. And into that mix, influencing the sentiment or the thinking in the market, are all of these rumors and myths and the propaganda that's thrown out there to confuse us all or to influence the market. And a lot of the aspects of sentiment are very short-term thinking. So whereas the supply is not going to change particularly quickly, demand might change quicker than supply, but not particularly quickly, sentiment can change in a day, even in an hour on some sort of announcement. So we need to keep an eye on what are people thinking. And as we look at the market, what's very revealing of market sentiment is, of course, the actions, whether people are buying or not, whether they are selling or not, but also what they're saying. That in order to have a good market information function in our businesses or in our agencies or in our development organizations, in order to understand how the market might move in the future. So let's start by looking at Vietnam, the biggest buyer of raw cashew nuts as a country. 1.95 million tons of raw cashew nuts bought by Vietnam between January 2022 and the 15th of January this year. And if we look at that, we try to get to an idea of the trend. So rather than trying to guess, because it would be a guess, exactly what is in the warehouses and on ships on the way to Vietnam, we looked at what was the net situation last year of all the imports, the crop, domestic consumption, what was the net impact? And we calculated that, and you can see that it appears to be that the inventory from the beginning of 2022 to the beginning of 2023 was reduced. And that's an important factor. So if we look at overall situation, Vietnam on average used about 242,000 tons of raw cashew nuts per month in 2022, and inventories are reduced by roughly, and these are rough figures of course, because some of these figures we cannot be absolutely accurate about. We know imports are accurate, we know the crop is pretty accurate. Import of kernels is actually quite difficult because we know there's a lot of import of cashew kernels into Vietnam, and we know there's a lot of export of cashew kernels, but not in the typical cashew format nowadays. So they're getting exported under other tariff headings. And that factor we've tried to adjust in here, but it is a difficult factor. So what we're saying is that the inventory in Vietnam is reduced by something like 20 days usage. So it's not a huge factor. It is a reduction. It is moving in the right direction. And we have seen some significant changes in some of the structures and the procurement businesses in Vietnam over the past year. If we look in India, so India has become, in 2022, a record importer of raw cashew nuts, an increase of 43%. Surge in demand in India post-pandemic. I think myself that it's a much more fundamental thing and it will be with us for time to come. Therefore, India has a higher closing stock at the end of the year. As you can see, the orange bars 2022, the blue 2021. And India would have a stock, according to my calculations, of 2 to 3 months of supply, which, if you think about it, given that the Indian crop will really only start to become available in March, and the imports from West Africa, even though there is some stock available in West Africa, that the imports will only start to reach the market there in March, that stock is needed. So let's just try and make some sense of these figures on the inventories. So Vietnam, lower than 2022, not unusually low, not unusually high either. There may be some stocks of very low quality material lying around, but when you convert that into kernels, it doesn't mean an awful lot. I don't think that the current inventory in Vietnam will have a huge impact on the initial RCN trading this year. whatever people are telling us. If we look in India, I think that the inventory is higher than 2022, but again, not overly high, not something that's in any way a crisis, and that it will have a low enough impact on the RCN trade in the early months of the year. West Africa, I would say that the inventory available in West Africa is higher than last year, higher than normal, and that there is a significant risk that the raw cashew nuts that are around various countries in West Africa will miraculously change from 2022 old crop to 2023 a new crop. And that's significant because that will potentially impact quality. Impacting quality impacts price, and there is a possibility that that can impact prices negatively. However, I think that the overall impact of those remaining inventories is relatively moderate. Three factors on inventory. Nothing there that really would make us think that the market will be particularly aggressive and moving up or particularly negative and falling down. The key factor at this time of year has become the Cambodian crop. So Cambodia is now, as you know by now, a huge producer of cashew nuts. You can see in the chart, the blue bars are production in RCN tons, and you can see that this just took off in recent years. It's not all been plain sailing. Over the past 2 years, they tell us that about 100,000 hectares has been removed, mostly new trees, and mostly to substitute with fruit trees or other crops, which are giving much better returns than cashews, based on the opening of the Chinese market to imports of these products from Cambodia. So generally speaking, I haven't been in Cambodia yet this year, but I'm told the weather has been good and the crop prospects are good. Estimates of the crop widely vary, but let's look for a moment at the impact. So this chart is an availability chart, so you can see the red bars. So keep an eye on the red bars. Those would be the availability of raw cashew nuts for import at destination. So this is the moments when they arrive. So not much is available in March, but that increases as the year goes on. Now, what's had a huge impact on that in recent years is the availability of RCN from Cambodia, which comes into play at this time of year. So you can see that the February, March, April, the blue bars, Vietnam and Cambodia, has moved up. So the impact of the increase in production in Cambodia has been felt in two ways. Firstly, the availability of raw cashew nuts has shifted to earlier in the year. 700, 800,000 tons, probably more this year in Cambodia, available earlier and available more. So since 2019, we've seen this tremendous availability, which has caused a change in the pattern of buying by Vietnamese processors. Vietnamese processors can look to Africa later because they have supplies from Cambodia, and they can look to Africa less, again, because they have supplies from Cambodia. And the combination of these factors has kept kernel prices relatively low in recent years, those and other factors. So if we look at Cambodia now coming into 2023 season, the outlook is for a good crop this year. Figures suggest somewhere around about 875,000 tons is possible. There has been a significant reduction in the area under cashews. It seems to me that the growth, the prospects for continued growth in Cambodia are now limited. We do think that following the launch of the new government policy for cashews in the country on the 13th of January, that we will start to see more processing, more value addition, and some more regulation of the sector, moving it a little bit away from simply exporting raw cashew nuts, but it will be predominantly for some years to come an exporter of raw cashew nuts, and they will go, of course, overwhelmingly into Vietnam. So from an African perspective, the arrival of Cambodia has meant later demand from Vietnam, or at least the need for later demand from Vietnam, and potentially lower demand from Vietnam. So, for example, if we look at remaining inventories at the end of 22 in West Africa, we can say that those are directly the result of increased production in Cambodia. Let's focus then on production. Early indications, Vietnam, it looks as if the crop will be a little bit later than it could be, and it'll probably be no better than last year. That remains to be seen, of course, but those are the initial indications. Very positive forecasts from Cambodia. As I've mentioned, a much better crop than last year is forecast. Again, that's still to be seen, but it is getting close to harvest time now, and it does look as if that will come true. If we look in India, I'm hearing mixed reports from India. The Indian crop is spread over a very wide area now. Some areas have some questions as to the weather and to the climatic conditions in the course of the growing season, particularly during flowering, and it does remain to be seen. It is quite difficult now to get an early indication of how the crop is looking in India, because it is spread over a vast area. There was a time when it was concentrated in South India, in Southwest India, but today it's moved much north and east. So it is difficult because of different conditions, India being a vast country, of course, to get an idea of exactly what we should expect. In West Africa, from what I hear so far, I was in Côte d'Ivoire about 2 weeks ago, good growing conditions. I hear good crop forecasts, but those remaining stocks are still in place. East Africa, well, we are past the harvest time. Definitely the crop in Tanzania was a little bit disappointing. Mozambique forecast to be improved, but we're still waiting, or at least I'm still waiting to see exactly what that meant and exactly what was delivered by farmers in Mozambique. I don't think overall, looking around the continent of Africa, that we are seeing any real indicators of poor crops, particularly in West Africa, but nor are we seeing any indicators of really big bumper crops. So again, it looks like in West Africa, we're looking at something like last year. Good crops, certainly enough, but that increase in production that has been hoped for hasn't really been happening. So looking again at production, let's have a look now at demand. And let's have a look, to start with, let's have a look at US demand. So US figures are published monthly. We don't have December yet, but you can see the red bars that 2022, which is the red, was not an especially good year. In fact, in the latter half of 2022, and really from July onwards, compared to the previous year, we saw a very sharp fall in imports. So you're looking at July, August, September, October, November, and most certainly December, all below the previous year, and more surprising, below any year going back to 2019. So this was a significant reaction. Now, that was down to a whole range of factors. We see there was much higher inventory at the opening of the year. If you look at the annual imports, and we see the imports for 2021, we see a very, very high figure, a big jump from 2020, a big jump from 2019, and that had a certain carry-in into 2022. So this impact of the pandemic was increased demand, but naturally buyers bought in anticipation of that demand, but it didn't continue. And from March, April of 2022, demand slipped away, and of course inventories grew. So high inventory at the opening meant that they didn't need as many cashews imported as the year went on. Secondly, the inflation, the growth of inflation, the scare around inflation. Most people had not seen inflation at these levels in their lifetime. You have to go back to the 1970s to see that kind of inflation, and that made people very nervous. There was also perhaps, I suspect, something of a post-pandemic adjustment. People had consumed a lot of snacks at home during the pandemic. They associated snacks perhaps with being home during the pandemic, and they got out and they left those snacks behind for a while. But by the middle of the year, the inventories would have been adjusted. Our buyers had adjusted, and they then adjusted their inventories. So they did not import inventories. Imports some months were down by 30%. So two things happened. You reduce your stock by not importing more, and you reduce your forward buying. Now, that appears to be showing some slight change now. We saw from Vietnam quite strong figure for export to the US in December, 12,560 tons, which would be quite a good number. That figure those goods will arrive probably during February, and February is normally around the 10, 11,000 tons. So in the US, we're seeing the possibility of a readjustment back to the normal growth trend. Now, one thing I would mention in here is that there has been quite a large increase in the import of packed roasted, consumer packed, which means below 1 kilo packs of cashews into the United States, mainly from Vietnam. And that figure of 2022 is a little distorted because we are still looking at which tariff headings those goods were imported under. We want to get a monthly figure on that, and we will have to figure out a way to adjust the overall import figure to compensate for a range of different tariff headings, some of which are mixed nuts, just to make the life of the analyst a little bit more difficult. What do we see in 2023? Well, I think we will see the impact of these low prices. As we'll talk about shortly, cashew prices are remarkably low. Cashew kernel prices are remarkably low, and that is bound to have an impact on the market at some point. We are seeing, and we will continue to see, a slowing of the impact of inflation. So therefore, I think we will see a return to the trend, i.e. a trend in growth. Now, as you can see, the US consumption growth is relatively slow. The US is quite a mature market for cashew nuts. So growth in imports over the years has been relatively slow, averaging something like 2%. 2020 and 2021 were more or less exceptions. During the pandemic, the consumption of snack foods jumped. So I think that we probably will see a return to slower growth, but I think it will be growth. And although you couldn't rule out a jump back toward 2019 levels during 2023, it seems to me that the growth will only kick in the second half of the year. So we may see better imports in the second half of the year. Now, by the way, don't forget, if you're going to import the products in July, you're buying them latest March, April. So we could see that increase in imports over last year. I'm fairly certain we will, but we won't see anything spectacular. The best we are likely to see in the United States is a return to this kind of slow growth pattern. Now, the US will remain a large importer. But in the US market, price is really important. So low prices will have an impact on demand as time goes on. Having a look at Europe. So Europe was far less impacted by all of these factors last year. Imports were down. But if we look at the situation in Europe, we can see that compared to 2019, imports were still very, very strong. So Europe sustained the increases that happened during the pandemic much more in 2022 than the US market. This is the EU and the UK combined. We've also seen an increase in roasted packed nuts into the European Union, but probably at lower volumes or lower percentages than the US market. Again, we had a very strong start to 2022 in the European Union. I think January of 2022 imports were up 34% on the previous year. Similar situation to the US, where a very strong start slowed imports later. But on average over the year, it was in this range, 3 to 4%. I'm quoting a range because we don't have the final figure for December yet. But some months, it was down by as much as 17%. So high in the early part of the year, impacted in the second half of the year. Overall, not such a bad performance. Question is, are we likely to see the return to growth in the coming year? Looking at China, China is, by the standards of the US market or the standards of the European market, China is quite a small market. China's 50, 60, 70,000 tons, depending on the year, of kernels. European market, as you can see, has reached somewhere in the region of 160,000 tons. But China is important. It's important for Vietnam as a close, accessible market, a source of quick sales, quick cash flow, especially early in the year. And China also is important because it has this tremendous potential to just explode, as we saw in the past in other nuts, almonds, for example. Imports, if it catches big, and you can see a very, very sharp increase. But 2022 was down 12% on 2021, which, given the impact of COVID in China during 2022, continued lockdowns, continued zero COVID policy during that year, it was quite a creditable performance. I think the number is 75,000 tons of imports from Vietnam, which is a little bit lower than 2019, just 2% down. But overall, if we look at that trend in China, there is a trend of growth. But as you can see from the bar chart, it has been quite erratic. And part of the reason for that is that the seasonality of demand in China. So if we look in 2020, the impact of the pandemic in late 19 and early 20 impacted imports. 2021 eased a little bit, and then again in 2022 we saw this drop. But China remains a very interesting market. There is, of course, the question as to whether or not China will build, or Chinese companies will build, processing plants, and that we could see some of this demand, which is currently from Vietnam, switch to demand for raw cashew nuts. That is always a possibility for China, and it's something that probably we need to keep an eye on. There is, of course, the other possibility that Chinese businesses invest at origin and build their own processing plants. And there is certainly evidence that that is happening in some cases. So looking at these factors for the first quarter, so we talked about what should we look at in the first quarter, what are the important things? And we characterized them under these three areas: supply, demand, and sentiment. And in terms of supply, we're coming to the conclusion that inventories, RCN inventories, are lower than they were at the start of last year, but higher than they were at the beginning of what might be called the last normal year, 2019. Crops, on what we get as input at the moment, the overall crop production situation looks like average to good, maybe with the exception of Vietnam, a question mark over India, but generally looks positive elsewhere. In West Africa, the largest production region in the world, in Côte d'Ivoire, the largest production country in the world, the crop situation looks pretty good. There does not seem to be, at least on the calculations, there does not seem to be an issue of kernels inventories at destination. people can tell you that they have so many containers in the warehouse, but you always have to look at that in the context of demand. What is the demand? What sounds like a lot of containers in a warehouse may not actually be in a country that uses 180,000 tons of kernels a year. So this is something that I know is going around at the moment, people saying we have enough kernels to last us forever. Let's be careful on that one, because it's actually could be a signal that there's some buying to be done. If we look at demand, one of the key impacts of what happened in 2022 is that forward cover is lower than normal. Now, that's got two impacts. On the one hand, it means that kernel buyers will need to buy. They will probably have more open positions, more buying to do right now than in a typical year. But it also means that processors, export processors in Vietnam, will have lower commitments on sales, which means that their pressure to purchase raw cashew nuts might be a little bit less than normal. So given the forecast of a good crop in Cambodia, and given probably less sales forward than normal, there seems to be very little impetus behind the demand for raw cashew nuts right now. So whereas I think for the year, demand for RCN will be good, I don't think that there's any hurry on buyers, particularly Vietnamese buyers, to get moving in the market. So it would be reasonable in that situation to expect a relatively slow start to the season. Keep an eye on what happens in Cambodia if you want to know what might happen next in the international RCN market. And then on consumer trends, so when we talk about consumer trends, we're talking about buying by consumers in North America, Europe, the Middle East, particularly in India, and to a lesser extent in Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. It looks to me as if the trend will revert to the norm. That does not mean that we will see fast growth in demand, but the combination of a return of the consumer trend to what it was prior to the pandemic and low forward cover and low prices could spell a volatile period at some point in 2023. I don't feel that's going to be in the early part of the year, though. When we think about the sentiment, when we think about how people feel about the market, what they think about the market, we need to look at that as well. If we look at processors, I think in general, given their experiences in the second half of last year, processors probably come into this year feeling a little bit negative. They will be cautious, particularly Vietnamese processors, particularly the non-multinational processors, the smaller companies, the mid-sized companies. Traders, particularly traders of RCN, are probably less committed at the moment to contracts than they usually are. They will need to do some business, but they really don't have big positions to talk about. They're neither snowed under with inventory, which would cause them to talk the market up a little, nor are they fully committed on sales contracts, which would cause them to talk the market down. Economic conditions are improving. We often see the impact of reports about inflation, reports about other economic aspects, recessions, and so on, having an influence, and sometimes having an influence which is entirely unjustified. To a certain extent, that's what happened last year, but definitely Western countries' economic conditions are improving. I think the same can be said in India, and that would be positive. The normal efforts to talk prices of RCN down at this time of year are in train. What else would you expect? So we'll have a look then, and we'll have a look, think about what happened in 2022 and how are those factors likely to influence 2023 season. So let's have a look. In 2022, perhaps each of the last 3 years were years of different crises. Now, we had the COVID crisis, we had the knock-on effect on logistics, we had economic, perhaps not crisis, but perhaps the talk of crisis, and that impacted the market sentiment. And that led, to example, for a major stop, collapse is not too strong a word, in the second half of the year for US imports. If we look at this situation now, certainly the lockdowns, not COVID, not the impact of COVID, but the lockdowns and the economic disruption around that is gone in many countries and certainly on the way out in others. So the positive impact of lockdowns on buying is completely gone, and the negative impact of the lockdown on freight, logistics, inflation is receding to a certain extent. A certain amount of confidence is returning to the market as these crises recede. For example, it's now expected that the US and most European countries will avoid a major recession in 2023. That has an impact. The impact of the disruption to freight and logistics has receded. So freight rates have tended back toward maybe not the rates that they were, but the equalization, the advantage of freight from West Africa on kernels, for example, has relatively dissipated in the second half of 2022. Second big factor of the year, and probably the biggest factor of the year in the cashew business, is the growth in India. We've seen how Indian consumption, which is domestic consumption primarily, increased in 2022. We saw how export again declined. And this looks as if it's here to stay. This shift in consumption toward healthier foods, the shift away from bulk wholesale to packed retail, gifting, the fact that cashews are linked to prosperity or perceptions of prosperity, and the further diversification of the use of cashew nuts in, for example, in snacking, in roasted and salted snacks coming up in the Indian market. It seems unlikely that we would see the same year-on-year growth, 22 to 23, as we did from 2021 to 22, but it does look likely that we will see continued growth in the Indian market. And that, as somewhere in the region of 40% of world demand, this is a huge factor. For African trade, this is expressed in demand for raw cashew nuts. You virtually cannot export cashew kernels to India. So this increase in demand, as it was in 2022, about 1.4 million tons imported, that will be shown again in demand for raw cashew nuts. Let's have a look at production. So last year we saw, again, a relatively strong trend in production. We have to look a little bit more closely at that. And we've seen that Africa over the longer period has been the fastest growing region. I've taken all of Africa as a single region for the purposes of this. And we can see over the years that production in Africa has been growing fast. India's slow growth, no change in that. That's not likely to change this year. Vietnam, virtually no increase in production for a number of years now. And it's been Cambodia that has been the driver of increased production in recent years. So yes, we saw African production continue to rise, but a little bit of a slowdown in recent years. But we've seen this explosion in Cambodia. And the question, as I was saying earlier, the question now is that over? Have we got a production volume in Cambodia that's going to be set for the coming years? It will likely increase slowly because trees will mature and production will rise. But if we get a situation where it becomes more attractive to plant other products, then we could see a slowdown in production growth. This has a huge impact on the Vietnamese cashew industry. Vietnam imports 1.9 million tons. It imports about 35% of that from Cambodia in 2022. So the development of the Cambodian cashew industry is a very important factor for Vietnamese processors. Clearly, with an early and a large crop in Cambodia, you could never get a repeat of the situation of 2017, where a poor crop in Vietnam led to almost panic-stricken buying of raw cashew nuts early in West Africa. So as I was saying, this has impacted the buying calendar. Question now is, what's the future there? And it looks, on what we know today, it looks as if perhaps the growth in Cambodian production has slowed down to a much more normal level, and this growth spurt is over. I don't think, for example, immediate forecasts of 1 million tons for Cambodia make any sense anymore. Big difference now, of course, is we know from 18, 19, 20, it was very difficult to judge what was happening in Cambodia, whether this would actually turn into production. And now we know what we're dealing with. And from an African point of view, looking at Cambodia, establishing relationships with Cambodia and understanding Cambodia is important. Fourth big factor from last year, and indeed from the year before, is this problem of, relatively speaking, RCN prices trading higher than kernels. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but this is there. It looks at the moment to be still in place. Some people will say raw cashew nuts are too high in price. Others, including myself, will say that kernels are too low in price. And some of us would say that this problem is self-inflicted by the industry by allowing kernels prices to drop so significantly in recent years. Trends in consumption. These big trends are still there: health, innovation, taste, corporate social responsibility, sustainability. Big factor coming in 2023. A big topic of conversation is likely to be traceability. Why is it likely to be a big discussion in 2023? Well, because it's become the law. And it's become the law in Germany. And within a couple of years or less, it's likely to become the law in the European Union. And this is really important for two aspects. One, it means you need to know where your product came from and to be able to explain it as far back. But two, and more importantly, you're now responsible as a major buyer, and it starts with major buyers, but it will eventually impact all buyers. It means you are responsible for what goes on in the chain. So if we think about sustainability, if we think about traceability, if we think about being responsible in that chain, really, you have to say that only origin processed kernels can meet the full requirements. That means kernels that are processed in the location, in the region, in the country where they are produced. That seems to me the only way, regardless of talk about the smart systems for tracing cashews, regardless of satellite imaging, labeling, all of these things. It doesn't seem to me that there is a genuine way to fulfill all of the parameters. Yes, you can probably track the goods, but no, you cannot track the social impact of those goods, of that production. So this is a huge factor, and it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And from the African perspective, this is an area which offers competitive advantage, significant competitive advantage. Allied to that, you would hope, and I think is happening, that African processors are catching up in terms of costs. So Vietnam has led the way in terms of the cost of processing. You can see in the chart a rough idea. It doesn't apply for all factories, but it is a cross-section. Large semi-mechanized plants, this is roughly the cost per ton to process RCN, in my experience, in people I've spoken to. And you can see that there is still a significant advantage. Part of the advantage is countered by the cost and the increasing cost of bringing the raw material to market. So if your cost in Vietnam is $200 a ton and your cost in Mozambique is $400, you have to ask the question, what's the cost of bringing the material, that 86% of material which was imported to Vietnam in 2022, what is the cost per ton of bringing that there? And this is evening up the calculation. So on the one hand, you have this improved processing, which doesn't go for all factories, but it is for many. As time goes on, management improves, use of the machines improves, and you see a more competitive processing industry. The sustainability advantage remains in place. Origin processing, closeness to market, avoiding large volumes of RCN moving around the world, reduced environmental impact, reduced carbon footprint. So I do suspect that we're going to see a continued catching up by African processors on Vietnamese processors. I speak of Vietnam because India is a different situation. So Indian processors are processing mainly for consumption in India. As we saw earlier, Indian exports of kernels play less and less a part in the industry in India. So let's have a look then at this problem, at this raw cashew nut costs versus kernels prices. So when we look at it, first thing we need to look at is the cost of kernels. So this is an effort to try to calculate based on Vietnamese local or Cambodian raw cashew nuts, Vietnamese processing of Ivorian raw cashew nuts, Indian domestic processing of domestic product, Indian processing of raw cashew nuts origin Benin, and then an Ivorian processor, a highly efficient Ivorian processor's calculation using Ivorian raw material. And what we see is that in the case of the two Vietnamese examples, taking the current price of WW320's FOB Vietnam, that in both cases you're looking at the market price being below the cost price based on today's raw cashew nuts. If we look in India, margins are there because the kernels market in India is of course much higher than the international market, but again margins are relatively tight. And if we look in the Ivorian situation, an efficient Ivorian processor sourcing raw cashew nuts locally and efficiently should be in a position to make a trading margin. So if we look at that in terms of gross margin, and again, you know, when you look at these figures, these are generalizations using lots of data collected from different processors. So your situation might be different to this, but this is just a general situation. Now, if we look at this, and if we take the average raw cashew price in 2022 and the average cashew kernels price based on 320s in 2022, you end up with a situation where really nobody is doing that well. A typical Vietnamese processor would be losing money. Now, that doesn't mean all Vietnamese processors are losing money. Some will have higher price sales, some will have had forward sales, some will have bought their raw cashew nuts below the average, some will have very efficient processes. It does look as if the situation on imported raw cashew nuts is a little bit less bad than on local, because local raw cashew nuts are a very high price. If we look in India, margins tight, but at least profitable. But this is not the kind of margin that you would need really to sustain a business. And if we look at the very best in Côte d'Ivoire, we see that it is possible to make a margin. But what you can see on these is that none of these businesses are making gross margins. So we're talking here about gross margin, not net margins. We're looking at gross margins that are below 25%, even in the best case, and most of them below 10%. Hard times for processors. It just doesn't make sense. So if we looked at it, by my calculations, if we took the average raw cashew nut price over 2022, then 320s would need to rise to 330 to make a decent profit margin in the region of somewhere between 25 and 30%. Looking at it the other way, and we say, based on 2022 kernels prices, raw cashew nuts would need to be lower by about $250 a ton to offer processors the kind of margins which you would expect in a food manufacturing business. As I said earlier, whatever way you look at that, whether you say kernels prices are too low or RCN prices are too high, depends on the way you look at the market and depends on the factors that you take into account. But certainly, we are a long way away from where we should be. Interestingly, on these calculations, a good, efficient West African processor is not in a bad position at all. And that's without taking into account any premiums for African kernels, which have been offered in recent years. So looking a little bit more back at the history of this, and let's think back, how long has this been going on? And so I look back over some of our discussions, and we asked these questions back as far back as June 2021. And we were asking at that time, why would the dominant supplier, Vietnam of course, crash kernels prices when demand was growing? Why would you crash prices when they were already at 5-year lows? Why would you crash prices when the cost of import were increasing so much? As we saw, if you look at the red segments in these bar charts, the red segments are the cost of delivery of product, RCN, from its origin to the processing points. So you can see in this that for an Indian processor, for a Vietnamese processor using African RCN, the cost of delivery is very high. Cost of delivery includes taxes, freight, insurance, finance, and all those other factors. But for a West African processor buying locally, or a Vietnamese processor buying locally in Vietnam or in Cambodia, these red bars are much lower. And you can actually take the cost of delivery as an indicator of the environmental impact too. It's also an impact of the sustainability of the chain. And this is giving us, for some time now, strong indications that there's problems in this chain. If we have a look at last year, so a year ago, here's the calculation that I've just shown you for 2023. It doesn't look an awful lot different. If anything, the situation for Vietnamese processors has become worse. The situation for Indian processors is maybe slightly worse, but maybe not such a big factor, but it has become worse for Vietnamese processors. And that's a crisis. And we shouldn't forget that we might think when we look at the African cashew sector that we want to see processing, and you know that I do. But we also have to realize that the market for most of the raw cashew nuts that is produced remains Vietnam. And without Vietnam, where would RCN prices be? So this crisis concerns us all. We have to ask the question, how long can low margins or no profit margins continue? And we also always in these cases, we should ask who benefits from this. Is it the RCN trade? And probably it isn't. Is it the RCN trader who's also a processor? Possibly. Actually, the biggest beneficiaries from this situation would be large companies that are RCN traders, that are processors, and are themselves also roasters or exporting roasted products. So who really fails in this situation? Well, it's the mid-size and particularly the small processor that gets squeezed out. So the question I'm starting to ask is, are we really looking here at some kind of forced rationalization in the industry? Is the industry, through a crisis of profit margins, ending up in a situation where the big get bigger, where the idea of further value addition and finished products catches hold as a solution to a problem that really is rooted not in the process, not in the market, but in the dysfunctional supply chain for raw cashew nuts. It is not 21st century to be moving raw material 4 times the weight of the finished product, 30,000 kilometers from one side of the globe back to the other. And we have to ask, does this trend toward more finished products, will this work? Or will it simply create more problems? One thing that in the finished product industry, the diligence, the supervision, the auditing becomes much more strict. So when we talk about labor practice, when we talk about food safety, when we talk about genuine certification, these are all factors that come into play. One failure in those areas closes you down. That doesn't happen in the cashew kernels trade, but it can happen in the finished product trade. And entering into that market as the solution to this problem may indeed cause a whole new set of problems. So we have a long shadow thrown by the events of the pandemic. We have a long shadow of the events even of 2022, the logistical breakdown, the economic breakdown, and that shadow will cast itself over the coming year. So what are the trends to watch in 2023? Well, let's have just a quick look at some of them. First of all, I got asked the question, how quickly will demand respond to low prices? So here you've got a chart showing prices since April 2016 through into just January of this year. You've got 4 grades, large pieces, splits, W240s, and in red, the 320s, which is the key one to watch. So we look at the 320s, compare it to the 5-year average price and to the 2-year average price. And what we find right now is that prices of 320s are below both. In a normal market situation, that would be an indicator that things are going to change quite soon. If we look at the highs and the lows, we see that the current market is hovering in and around the lows. Certain things also jump out. 240s, for example, look undervalued. The pressure to sell 240s has caused them to get rather close to the 320 price compared to past years. It tends to happen when the market is very high and when the market is very low. It's also a response by processors who need to generate cash flow, drop the price of the higher grades, move them on, and at least generate some more cash at that moment. So how quickly will demand respond to low prices? Well, I'm tempted to say very quickly, but then if I temper that with the experiences of 2022, particularly amongst buyers in the US, I think that might take a little bit longer, and it might actually be the second half of the year before we see anything. It is unlikely that buyers will make a move before they see what's happening on the new crop. But it's also likely that if there was to be any problems with the Northern Hemisphere new crop, that buyers would come in very quickly. That leads us to a potentially difficult situation. We've talked about low forward cover amongst kernel buyers. We've talked about reducing inventory in destination markets. If demand returns, low prices change to rising prices. Rising prices change to contract default. There will be more defaults this time around because there have been more defaults by buyers on the way down. We could see a situation where we get volatility. Contract default accentuates that. It always has. We've talked about more value addition from Vietnam. We see here this product is packed in Vietnam. This product is branded Vietnamese jumbo wrapped cashews. One is from the United States, one is from the UK. But if we look at that and if we think about greater alignment with consumer demands, what would consumers say if they knew the carbon footprint of these cashews? You know, you can claim gloriously grown extraordinary nuts without saying that actually they were grown half a world away from where they were processed before they were shipped to you in the UK. These are huge factors, and consumers are unaware of those. If they were, who knows what the reaction would be. And this, of course, is in direct contradiction of the realignment of our industry and most industries with consumer demands. So these issues that we've talked about on this event previously, the quality of the product, diversified chain, traceability, labor and environmental compliance. I see this as a threat to our industry. I mean, what would a cashew buyer consumer think if they knew how the business really works? If they really knew the ins and outs of that chain from a country, any country really in West Africa, all the way through shipping, export, processing, and then re-export and shipment, what would they think? And we have this huge contradiction there. And this is something that is, in my opinion, a threat to the industry. So when we look at buyers and talk about sustainability and talk about closer relationships with processors at origin, we really have to question some of their actions. And we can ask the question, and this for me is the big question for 2023. Are we at a crossroads for sustainable sourcing that will bring African cashews to the forefront of the market? African cashew kernels, of course. African cashews, including RCN, are already at the forefront of the market. Well, we could be. But if we look at some of the events of 2022, if we look at some of the US buyers abandoning deals when their demand slipped, walking away from sustainable sourcing, when we look at some supermarkets, European supermarkets reneging on promises of support for impact projects, when we look at, incredibly, European organic importers defaulting on contracts and causing great difficulty for their suppliers as a result, simply because their demand had slipped and they were losing money. That is directly contrary to the ideas of sustainable sourcing. So the answer to the question, are we at the crossroads, is, yeah, maybe it is happening slowly, but it still seems that many buyers are not convinced. It still seems, to me at least, that short-term thinking is alive and well amongst buyers of cashew kernels. And it's only when that really changes that we will be able to say that we've reached the crossroads for sustainable sourcing that will bring African cashew kernels to the forefront. Thanks very much indeed. That's it from me today. It's been a pleasure to talk about cashews as always. I will hand you back to Blessing, and if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the updates. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions or need for clarification, you may use the Q&A feature or raise your hand, use the raise hand feature, and then we'll call you in to ask your question. Jim, we have some questions here, which I'm going to read out. We have 3 questions already in the Q&A feature. And the first question is, what could processors do different as the market returns to normal or aftermath COVID?
Well, I would like to see processors concentrate on their marketing, on their sales and marketing function more, starting actually to sell, starting to develop marketing functions which highlight the competitive advantages of buying in African countries, number one. And secondly, I think that processors need to look at their supply chain and develop their supply chains much more in line with the trends in buyers' demands, and particularly the consumers' demands. I think that this is processors have done so much to develop the industry and the technology, and they've taken risk, and they should be rewarded for that. They need now to work on the neglected aspects. The factories were put up, now you need to work on the sales, now you need to work on the marketing, now you need to work on that proposition for the buyer, but that needs to be supported by building a supply chain that just doesn't rely on ad hoc sourcing, but relies on a much more fundamental connection back to the supply chain and to the farm gate. It's a good question. There's a long answer to that too, which probably take a day to answer, but thanks for such a good question. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The second question is, considering Africa's production growth is now slowing down, what could be the impact?
Short-term impacts will be quite low because we have seen Cambodian raw material arrive into the market. Long-term impact, once we return to growth in demand, would be increased prices. I mean, you could eventually see a return to a situation of a very tight or a deficit situation once demand grows. That'll take some years. I would rather not see that impact. I would rather see a situation where production in Africa returned to growth. And it seems to me the best way to do that is to look at existing growers, make them more efficient, make sure that they are better trained, better supplied, that they have, when they do plant or renew trees, that they get the best varieties available based on research to do that. So the impact could be significant on the market globally, but the real impact of slowing down on growth should be to do something about it and to return African production growth, and particularly to enhance the quality of that production, in my view. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The third question, it says, if an efficient Cote d'Ivoire processor can process at $2 cost, why are they selling between 20 and 25 cents above Vietnam?
I didn't say that they can process at $2 cost by any means, but what I did say is that they are processing competitively. The cost depends on the cost of the RCN, so that's a snapshot. So we're not talking about that being the permanent situation. We took a snapshot average price during last year. Why are they selling 20 to 25 cents above Vietnam? Because they are better quality, more sustainable, closer to market, much more attractive in terms of the proposition on traceability, on the product story. And when you look at the quality of the product from many of the now processing factories in African countries, you see a return to the type of quality that we previously only saw from India, and we previously only saw that 20 years ago. And all of those are reasons. There was for a long time a situation where there was a huge freight benefit in terms of cost of freight. That's eased back now, but there's still, and there will always be, for buyers in Europe and North America, the benefit of having the product quicker, in a shorter transit time. You can rely on that product to be delivered more quickly, so you could, in theory, buy it later. By the way, it's not just African processors that are making 20 to 25 cents above Vietnam. Brazilian processors are also making significant premiums above Vietnam. And that is one of the reasons why earlier I was saying, in answer to the question, is RCN too high or are kernels too low? My answer is kernels are too low, if I have to choose one or the other. So other origins are also making significant price premiums above Vietnamese cashew kernels. Blessing.
Thank you, Jim. We have another question here. It says, how can African processors maximize the significant competitive advantage, especially with the inflation?
Well, if you have a competitive advantage, the first thing you need to do is to tell people that you have a competitive advantage and to tell your story and tell it well. That's the first step. The second step is to make sure that the process. So for example, if you have an opportunity to offer traceable cashews, you must also have a supply chain that can fulfill that need. So if you're buying ad hoc from traders, from the trucks that pass by your door, it's going to be very difficult to trace that product. So if the competitive advantage is there, you need to harness it, invest in it, and make sure that it is told as part of the story to your customers. And don't forget that there is an essential element to harnessing a competitive advantage, as the questioner puts it. And that is that you select the right customer that will appreciate that competitive advantage and that will see the value in it and therefore work with you, perhaps pay you a premium price, as has been happening, or engage in much more long-term contracts and relationships. So there, run your business as well as you possibly can is the way to harness and maximize competitive advantage. And to do that, you need to build at both ends, build on the marketing and build on the supply chain, assuming that you've already got your process efficient. Again, by the way, that's a great question. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the last question that I have here is, any projection, opinion about the African regional market for cashew kernels?
Well, as everyone knows, the consumption of cashew kernels in African countries is relatively low. Some countries have potential. So initially, I think we can say because of the low level of consumption, the chances of an increase are high. The chances of African countries becoming in the short term major consumers remain relatively low. There's a number of factors there. I mean, it's about taste, it's about eating habits, it's about some of the myths around consumption of cashew nuts. These are all factors. A certain extent, price is also a factor. I think that certain markets, Nigeria being one, have a good opportunity to increase their consumption of cashew kernels relatively quickly. Other countries need to look at methods to increase their local production. That might be focusing on certain types of products. Cashews as a substitute for peanuts, for example, as a substitute for peanut paste, cashew butter. These might be an area where a relatively competitively priced product can be harnessed to boost domestic demand. I think that regional consumption will increase, but it will be slow, and it does probably need initiatives from governments and from processors to make that happen. So it's not something that's going to, there will be no revolution, let's say, in regional consumption within African countries, but there should be slow growth. But meantime, keep an eye on certain markets. Nigeria, South Africa can be markets of high potential for cashew nuts as snacks. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have exhausted all the questions and I don't see any hand raised to ask any direct question. Just before we wrap up today, Jim, could you please tell us, what to expect in the next fortnight?
Well, in the next fortnight, we're going to see much more news come to the market. We're going to see the rumors and myths and propaganda crank up as the season starts to begin. I think that I don't anticipate any dramatic changes in the market, but look out for buying signals, look out for kernels buyers coming to market, starting to ask about what's going on. Keep an eye on the action of RCN buyers, particularly Vietnamese buyers. I think we're pretty sure that Indian buyers will come to the market in due course. How will the Vietnamese buyers react to the current situation is a much more difficult question right now. Maybe a slow enough start to the season this year, but as the year goes on, I think we might see some little bit more volatility and a little bit more positive changes. I'm hoping that we see a a move in the market that's slow and logical rather than any volatility as we've seen in the past. But I'll be back and I'll tell you what I've seen on the 15th of February, and I'm looking forward to that. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. It's my pleasure as always, and you can see my contacts on the screen if you want to contact me directly with some question regarding today's presentation. Feel free to do so. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Blessing too.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for starting the GME again with us. And thank you to our participants for joining us as we recommence the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Join us again on the 15th of February as we look at new crops, old stock, and the turning tide. We are grateful to our partners and sponsors who have continually made it possible for us to bring the ACA Global Market Encounter to you. And just to mention a few: Cashew Club, GIZ Move, SNI, Intersnack, and many others. Until we see you again on the 15th of February, do stay safe and bye-bye.
An African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse.
Recording stopped.
We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest,